We'll have some refreshments back here. It's in the overflow room, so you'll have to go out and kind of go around down this hallway. So there will be refreshments after the class. So without further ado, Dr. Jeff.
We good? All right. It was requested last night that we finish up the lesson I didn't get to finish last night before we move on to the next one, so we're going to do that. I'm still hoping that there will be some opportunity for Q&A, maybe in our session on Wednesday. So if you have any particular questions that you end up thinking of as we're moving through this material, then be sure to jot those down or just come up and ask me after the session's over, whatever you want to do on that. Contact me at AP. And I do have some materials available for purchase still up here, including several of these flooded books that go into this material in a pretty simplified way with images and so forth. Help you to go a little bit deeper, though, on some of these topics as they relate to the flood. A lot of the things that I'm not going to be able to cover this week that I include in that book, so check that out. Yesterday we began studying, trying to figure out what we can learn about the world as it existed prior to the flood. And so we started looking at, we talked about the geography aspect of it, what the actual physical geography of the earth might have been like. And then we started looking at the fossil record. The fossil record really can tell us a lot about what living things were like when the flood began. And so I was talking about the three sweeping traits of the fossil record. You know, the fossil record has long been considered a big argument for evolution. That's the way it's described in textbooks and by just layman people. But when you actually dig in, no pun intended, to the fossil record, you find actually that it is powerful evidence of the flood and of biblical creation. These three sweeping traits, we talked about abrupt appearance, the idea that when creatures show up in the fossil record, they're already fully formed and functional, they're simple and they're complex, and they're very diverse right off the bat. There's no evolutionary history. And then the second trait, remember, is stasis. So the creatures show up and then they stay the same throughout the fossil record with only little variety on the same basic kind of creature that showed up at the beginning. You don't see creatures turning into something else. So this lack of transitional creatures connecting one kind of creature to another, this is a major problem for the evolutionary model that the leaders of paleontology acknowledge, all the way back to even Charles Darwin. He recognized this as a major problem. And so we talked about that yesterday. And then we also started talking about a trait called extinction, the idea that a creature just goes out of existence. And so that's another sweeping trait of the fossil record, and you would expect, whether you're an evolutionist or a creationist, for there to be extinction. But what you would not expect in the fossil record, if you're an evolutionist, is mass extinction, where you have enormous numbers of species all go extinct at about the same time, because now you have to start talking about some kind of worldwide catastrophe that would cause that. And that doesn't fit with the uniformitarian Darwinian evolution concept. And it fits perfectly with the creation model. And then where we left off yesterday was I showed you there's 5 separate extinctions that are acknowledged to have occurred throughout history from an evolutionary perspective. Of course, they're talking millions of years, but they acknowledge some major extinctions. And so again, this is not what you'd expect if uniformitarianism is true. This is what you'd expect if catastrophism is true. The idea that major catastrophes that affect enormous parts of the world or the whole world itself have happened in the past, and if that is the case, you've got to take that into account in trying to make sense of what we see in geology. And yet uniformitarianism doesn't allow that. But where I left off with is, how would we as creationists explain 5 separate extinction events instead of just one from the flood? And that's a legitimate question to consider. And we would interpret the same supposed extinction data in a different way. And it's in a way that doesn't really cause the dilemma for creation that it does for evolution. So first of all, the dates of these extinction events are incorrect because they rely on radiometric data. So all dates that are in the millions of years can be telescoped to the biblical time frame when you realize that, for example, the nuclear decay rates were accelerated during the flood. So what that means, practically speaking, is all of the rocks that are thought to be millions, hundreds of millions of years old are actually much younger than they appear. They went through accelerated nuclear decay during the flood. So it makes sense that the rock layers then aren't as old as is claimed by evolutionists because, for example, carbon-14 is found in rocks and fossils that are buried in rock layers that are thought to be millions of years old. And we know that carbon-14 should be at completely undetectable levels in a mere 50 to 100,000 years. If you find carbon-14 in fossils, it's powerful testimony that they aren't billions of years old. And yet we find carbon-14 throughout the fossil record. And on top of that, paleontologists are now regularly finding in dinosaur fossils and other fossils that are supposed to be 65 to 250 million years old, they're finding soft, stretchy, unfossilized tissue with red blood cells still intact. And there's been dozens of species in which this has been found now over the last 2 decades. And so we know, based on experimental evidence, that these dating methods must have a problem. They're inflating ages. And the reason is, no doubt, due to the assumptions that these methods are based on. They assume constant nuclear decay, they assume a closed system, and they assume the rocks were at their beginning, they were initially completely composed of only parent elements, and I don't have time to go into that, but bottom line is all of the absolute dating methods, uranium, lead dating, rubidium, strontium, and so forth, are not reliable because of these assumptions. So to creationists, the flood likely corresponds roughly to what we think is the Cambrian through the Cretaceous periods of the fossil record, okay? So in conventional time, 540 million years ago to 66 million years ago in radiometric years. So to creationists, those layers are basically the result of sediment being deposited in the single year of the flood. So each of these extinction events, therefore, fall within the year-long flood that occurred just a few thousand years ago. So most of the geologic column and the fossil record give us an account of the flood's progression. So each of these major extinction events that have been highlighted by evolutionists, what they're actually probably telling us is the destruction of another of Earth's major habitats or ecosystems as the waters of the flood are continuing to rise and destroy the rest of the planet. And so it appears in the fossil record as an extinction event. What it really is individual habitats being wiped out progressively through the flood. So the flood apparently began at the base of the ocean floor, Genesis 7:11, and so the creatures at the base of the record are what we'd expect. They're creatures that lived on the ocean floor. And then as the flood progressed from the ocean floor, it started picking up swimming creatures and then moved towards the coastal habitats, picking up amphibians, and then on to continental habitats with reptiles, birds, and mammals. As an entire ecosystem or habitat is destroyed, the creatures from that ecosystem no longer show up in higher rock layers because those layers represent different habitats with their own plants and animals. And the obvious exception are the marine creatures. Once marine creatures appear in the fossil record, they continue to appear in the layers above, just as you'd expect if the flood happened. The flood pushed marine creatures onto the continents, and their fossils are found even in the middle of continents, way away from the coast. And that's significant. Evolutionists would have to say that continents were once the ocean floor, and that's why there are marine creatures on the continents. But the problem is that continental rock is made of granite. It's a completely different rock than the ocean floor, which is made of basalt. Continental rock is like a cork. It floats higher in the mantle, and the ocean floor made of basalt is more dense, and so it sinks relative to the continents. So the only way to get the ocean up over the continents is if the sea level, for some reason, has to rise high enough to flood the continents. And so bottom line, the fossil record is not a record of life over billions of years, as evolution would predict. It's a record of death by habitat in the year-long devastating worldwide flood that's recorded in the Bible. So the fossil record isn't about life, it's about death. It's a graveyard. The flood was so catastrophic in its effects on the earth that some species never recovered after the flood and went extinct due to completely new environments that were created by the flood, including the Ice Age, which would have begun soon after the flood. Regardless of a person's explanation of this evidence, extinction, not evolution, is a major trait of the fossil record. And the biblical global flood provides a powerful explanation for this sweeping trait of the record, for why worldwide death and extinction occurred in the fossil record. So the fossil record doesn't support evolution, it supports creation and the flood. The three dominant traits of the record: abrupt appearance with no evolutionary history, stasis with no evolutionary change, and then extinction from catastrophes, not uniformitarian processes. Each of these are exactly what we'd predict to be the case if creation and the flood, not evolution, were true. Now, since we know that the flood happened and that the fossil record documents some of what happened in the flood, then the fossil record can teach us a lot about the pre-flood world, biology-wise. How so? Well, since we know in the geologic column in the fossil record where the flood begins, the Cambrian Explosion, which is what we talked about yesterday, and we know about where it ends, roughly the top of the Cretaceous layers, then by studying the fossils in those rock layers, we're getting a snapshot of what living creatures look like when the flood began. You see that? And what we see is that in many cases, living creatures look pretty different, and in some cases, not so much. So regarding plants, we find that plants were abundant and grew to be very large, and the plant continents were very lush in the pre-flood world. The trees of the petrified forest out in northeast Arizona are trees that are thought to be from the pre-flood world, that were torn up and buried and then petrified rapidly due to the flood and then transported to the area that they're now in. The immense coal deposits found in the flood layers highlights how lush the pre-flood world was and how many plants were there. The rock layers in the flood seem to indicate higher levels of oxygen in the pre-flood world. Recall the enormous fruit still growing in Palestine a few centuries after the flood, when 2 Israelite men had to carry a cluster of grapes, remember, on a pole between them. So that kind of thing was probably not unusual in the pre-flood world. Large reptiles of the pre-flood era, of course, were the dinosaurs, like this Brachiosaurus that they had on display at the British Natural History Museum. I was at the Natural History Museum here for the U.S. here about a week ago, and they have there an Apatosaurus, I think, was on display, and they also have some Brachiosaurus skulls and some other sauropods. Notice I'm standing beside that guy for scale for you. And here is a Plesiosaur, so a huge marine reptile. Again, you can see me there for scale. Insects were huge as well. We have fossil evidence of these dragonfly-type creatures with wingspans of over 2 feet, the Meganeura. Also millipedes that were up to 7.5 feet long, called the Arthropleura. Sound pretty creepy, right? Again, higher levels of oxygen. So all of these things we can learn about the pre-flood world by studying the fossil record and the geologic column of those rock layers that we think correspond to the flood. And there are things we can learn about humans as well. We know from Genesis 4 that they were intelligent from the very beginning. They're already building cities, inventing musical instruments, doing farming, working with cattle, and even working with bronze and iron. All of this before the flood even happened. And so it's very possible that even iron pegs and nails were available to help Noah in building the ark. We can learn about their appearance, the appearance of humans, to some extent, because while the entire human habitat is absent from the flood layers, it was apparently completely destroyed, we can look at what humans look like immediately after the flood when they get off the ark and get an idea of what Noah and his family probably would have looked like. And there's a lot of variety in the humankind, in the same way there is in the dog kind and the cat kind and every other general group of creatures. Evolutionists tend to give new species names to groups that share similarities that are just slightly different from other varieties that we would actually say really fit within the same general kind that Moses was referring to. And so it is with Homo erectus and Homo demonesi. You might hear these terms. Statistical and biological studies by creationists have revealed that Homo erectus is just a variety of humans from the past that had, for example, a more pronounced brow ridge and a weaker chin, rather than the more pronounced chin that most of us have today. And then that is what the fossil record reveals humans looked like, likely, at the time of the flood. As mentioned earlier, humans were also able to live longer. Why is that the case? Well, we don't know for sure, but we can postulate several reasonable factors. We have to consider the lingering effects of the tree of life that might have been passed down genetically in some way. You would have a lot less genetic degeneration. So the genome, as it was created originally, would have been perfect. And it has now since deteriorated significantly. We've had a lot of accumulation of mutations and so forth. And so there would have been even much less disease and sickness before the flood. We have to consider things like radiation. Studies by creation geologists and geophysicists have revealed that the nuclear decay rates of the elements were accelerated by enormous factors during the flood, resulting in an immense amount of radiation being released in a short amount of time during and immediately after the flood for a period of time. So how would that have affected the human genome? Also, what's more, besides plants and animals, we know humans of giant stature walked the earth and are referred to there in Genesis 6:4 and continued to for some time after the flood, which hopefully we'll have time to look at examples of this later. We know that after the flood, they could reach at least 6 cubits in a span, or what scholars believe may be 9 feet 9 inches tall or taller, which would have been Goliath's approximate height if you assume a cubit is 18 inches from elbow to your middle finger. Before the flood, humans may have even been capable of greater heights than that. And one final aspect that I had wanted to cover yesterday that I wanted to highlight, that we can draw from the text in this period of history, after creation but before the flood, based on the genealogies of Genesis 5, we get a rough idea of how long people were apparently being able to live before the flood, and we find out how much time there was from creation to the flood, roughly 1,650 years. And with that information, we can get a rough estimate of how many people might have been on the earth by the time of the flood, based on certain reasonable assumptions. So if we assume people lived on average, say 900 years, and women continued having children for roughly the first half of their lives, as they do today, keeping in mind they may have been able to have kids much longer, 800 years or something, instead of, say, 450. If they started having children at the conservative age of 25, and we assume that people live long enough to see all of their grandkids, so they live 2 generations. So with these very conservative assumptions in place, we see that there could have likely easily been 215 million people on the planet, and that's really the low end of what it probably was. Very easily could have been 1 billion or more, and some commentators will even say that. All right. Jamie, let's go ahead and switch over to the other PowerPoint now. So this session, I'd actually wanted to dive into the flood itself. No pun intended. Actually, the pun kind of was intended on that. Remember our thematic verses for this week. You got Psalm 111:2. The works of the Lord are great, studied by all who have pleasure in them. And you think about the amazing things that God has done. He wants us to study that. Why? Well, because you learn about God. You learn about the things He's done. And I tell you, the more I study this subject of the flood, the more I am awed by what occurred in that event. This was no pleasure cruise that they were on. This was a major event. Remember also 2 Peter 3, verses 5 and 6. God doesn't want us to forget the flood and its significance. And so we're going through the biblical creation model, what the Bible and science say about this event. Remember, I mentioned briefly yesterday that you can learn some things about the first world as God originally created it in Genesis 1 up into the first sin, Genesis 3:6. And then you can learn about the fallen world in Genesis 4 and 5. And now we're going, and as well as the pre-flood world, it's geography, which we talked about, and it's biology, which we just finished. And so now we want to dive into the deluge and see what Scripture, first of all, says about this event. Genesis 4:26, which is the last verse of chapter 4 in the book of Genesis, tells us that after Seth had as a son Enosh, you have this phrase, men began to call on the name of the Lord. And then chapter 5 then gives the lineage of Seth and Enosh, the generations of individuals who were calling on the name of the Lord. But then things gradually changed over the next 1,600 years. The reason for the flood, given in the text, is that every intent or intention, the ESV says, of the thought of man's heart was only evil continually. The cause of that wicked state on the earth is given in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 6. The sons of God, apparently those good people that were just talked about, that were calling on the name of the Lord, following God. Remember, there weren't any chapter divisions in the original text. Those were added for our convenience later. Those people that it was just talking about began to notice physical beauty and prioritize that more in their marital decisions instead of things like virtues. The good people began marrying the daughters of men, an idiom for the worldly people, based on physical beauty rather than spiritual beauty. And let that be a warning to young people about what qualities you should be prioritizing in your dating and marital decisions. Verse 3, notice the phrase, his days shall be 120 years, Genesis 6:3 there. Some take this to mean maybe God was setting an upper limit as to how long man is going to be able to live from then on. He's not going to be able to live over 900 years, and now we're going to have 120-year max. And this doesn't work for at least a few reasons, which I tell you what, I'm not even going to try to wade through this right now just because for the sake of time. Talk to me about it. We've got an article that deals with that subject on our website. So let's jump on to the next part here. God instructs Noah to build this vessel, 300 by 50 by 30 cubits. And again, according to scholars, that would translate to a football field and a half long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet tall. And Noah is told to make this ark out of this unknown wood called gopher wood, put 3 levels on it, have rooms in it for the animals, cover it with a pitch of some sort so that it doesn't leak, and then put a door in the side of it. God tells him to install an opening. This is not really a window as we oftentimes think of it, but according to the underlying Hebrew, an opening for light and possibly ventilation that apparently went around the top of this vessel and was a cubit in height. And according to Genesis 8:13, a covering or awning of some sort was put over this opening as well, which was then left on until the end of these torrential rains, and then Noah opened this window-like structure to see the state of things after that. God apparently brought or sent the animals that he wanted on the ark to Noah. Noah didn't have to go hunt these down and try to pick which creatures would have the best genetic potential and the best health and so forth to repopulate the earth. No, God sends them to him or brings them to him. A male and female representative of your unclean animals, which you have to look elsewhere in the Pentateuch to try to figure out what that even refers to. Moses talks about that term elsewhere. And then according to chapter 7, 7 representatives of the clean kinds of animals. This is probably 7 individuals, not 7 pairs, although there is some debate about that. And again, these are representatives of what he calls kinds, not species. These are not necessarily equivalent terms. So animals from the earth, including birds, creeping things, which would have included various reptiles, insects, and possibly worms. Noah also brings food for his family and the animals, at least those that are not in a hibernative state. And after loading up, God himself shuts the door and the fireworks begin. And that, of course, brings us right up to the flood. So, again, the works of the Lord are great, studied by all who have pleasure in them. And it's worthy of our study and thought to think about this flood event. The flood was one of the greatest works that God ever did. And the Bible only tells us a few details about this event. It occurred 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. It was global in its extent. It covered everything. The fountains of the deep were broken up, and water came from the heavens. The mountains rose, the valleys sunk. It lasted basically a year, and that's what you get. And that's not really a lot to work with. So when you look up now from the pages of Scripture and you start looking around at the earth around us and you begin to study this great ancient work of the Lord, this key event in the history of mankind that God doesn't want us to forget, and you start looking for evidence of that event and you start trying to look at other things that happen in this event, then we want to see, can the Bible, the biblical account of this flood, be reconciled with the physical evidence? And are there other things we can learn by looking at the physical evidence? And we ask that question. What can we learn further from what we call the general revelation around us that God has revealed to us and the things that he has made, the things that he has done? Does the evidence from geology fit with Scripture, for example? Some have argued that the flood just could not have been global. There's just not enough water on the earth, they say. And so they'll look at the earth today and say, hey, if the flood happened, where'd the water go? I mean, is it in the sky? No, there's not enough water in the sky to cover the earth. If all of the water in the atmosphere was emptied onto the surface of the earth, it would only cover it to a depth of about 1 inch. Is it frozen in the ice caps? No, that wouldn't do it either. That would only cover the earth to a depth of 230 feet. Is it within the crust? That's a little more significant. There's an estimated 6 quintillion gallons of water in the earth's crust today. And so if all of that water was pumped back onto the surface of the earth, it would be enough to cover the earth with about 600 feet of water, so 2 football fields into the sky, and that's just the water hidden in the crust. But notice, sum total here, that's still pretty insignificant. We're only talking 1,000 feet total, and when you consider the height of some of the great mountains today, many of which are over 25,000 feet, you got a problem here. And so many of those who consider numbers like these and still want to believe in the Bible will often reject a worldwide flood and argue that the flood had to be a local catastrophe instead of a global catastrophe. Notice, in other words, they stop trusting what the Bible says because of their not understanding what's going on in the world around us, scientifically speaking. As we'll see, this argument simply cannot be sustained in light of either science or Scripture. The evidence points to a global catastrophe. How so? Well, let's start with a depiction of the flood, what modern creation scientists believe happened during the first few hours of the flood. You're not going to be able to hear this, I think, but you can at least see. That's a video that they have at the Ark Encounter, actually maybe at the Creation Museum up there in northern Kentucky, which I highly recommend you check that out if you have not gotten to go up there and see that. Modern creation science theorizes that much of the water in the flood actually came from the oceans and from below the earth rather than from the clouds above, which is what we were probably taught whenever we were young. But keep in mind that it's also incorrect to only think about the flood as involving just water coming down. The flood is a major geologic event. The whole earth is restructured based on what we're seeing whenever we study the earth around us. The phrase, the fountains of the great deep were broken up, that's significant. The great deep referring to the depths of the ocean. We're talking about what sounds like the breakup of the ocean floor. Proverbs 3:20 mentions this as well and states that the depths were broken up. The flood is a major geologic event, and notice that the text says that all the fountains of the great deep are broken up. There's more than just one, and all of them are broken up. Again, this suggests the breakup of the ocean floor. Now, the order of events mentioned in Genesis 7 is noteworthy to creation scientists. The fountains of the great deep are broken up. That's mentioned first, and then the rain is mentioned after that. So what exactly initiates this chain of events is still unclear. Did God just miraculously directly initiate the eruption of the fountains of the great deep, or did he use some kind of external physical entity striking the earth that starts this, like massive meteorites? And there is substantial amount of physical evidence that suggests that a lot of meteorites struck the earth during what we believe to be the flood rock layers. Secular geologists tell us that there are roughly 200 verified meteorite craters on the earth that have been verified as being from meteorites. There's a lot of others that are claimed to be, but these have been verified. And when you convert the dates and the layers they're found in and convert that to the biblical time frame, you find that 57% of the confirmed meteorite impacts throughout Earth's history struck during the single year of the flood. Another 23% of the confirmed meteorite impacts date to the period immediately following the flood. So from the flood through the Ice Age and up to Abraham. 80% of all of the known meteorite impacts occurred during the flood and then during the following few centuries as the earth was ultimately calming down. So I have trouble seeing that evidence and not think, wow, meteorite activity is a significant part of this event, may have even initiated the flood. But regardless, creation geologists have tried to piece together what may have occurred after it began, based on what we understand of geology today. So geologists have determined that the interior of the earth is comprised of a solid inner core, a liquid outer core, a mantle of predominantly solid rock, although the upper part has some plasticity, and then you have the crust upon which we live. Now, looking at the surface, geologists have discovered that the surface of the earth is broken up into plates that are still moving today on the order of centimeters per year. I mentioned this yesterday. So the earth is like a big cracked egg, and the earth, as far as we can tell, is unique in that. The earth is the only known planet to have these tectonic plates like this that move. Creation geologists believe the cracking of the egg may have occurred when the flood began. And recent articles by even various secular geologists suggest that plate tectonics may have been initiated by meteorite activity. Now, the model that describes the motion of these plates and the effects of that motion today is called plate tectonics. And so how do they know that plate tectonics theory is true? Well, several evidences, and I talk about some of these in the Flooded book and break that down for you. You can use GPS to detect the movement of the Earth's crust. Geologists have used dating methods to get the age of the ocean floor, and have found that the ocean floor actually gets older the further away you are from the mid-ocean ridge, for example, suggesting that new ocean floor is being made at the ridge and then moving away from the ridge in both directions. And then there is magnetic striping when measuring the polarity of the ocean floor. As you again move away from the ocean ridges, the polarity flips between north and south over and over and over. And the same pattern is mirrored on both sides of the ridges, again suggesting that magma is reaching the ocean floor, forming new rock, and then moving away from those ridges. And of course, perhaps the most obvious way to see the existence of these plates is to mark the locations of earthquakes and volcanoes on the planet. And they very clearly make a pattern when you map them out. So why would the earthquakes and volcanoes line up in that way? Well, most geologic activity on the Earth is thought to occur along the margins of these large pieces of crust called plates. As they move, they rub against each other, and that causes earthquakes and volcanoes and mountain building. And as these plates move relative to each other, we see different things happening. Some transform, where they slide past one another. And so like the San Andreas Fault is one of those out in California. Some diverge, so they move apart, and new material comes up from the mantle and fills in the gap. And we see this at mid-ocean ridges. Some will converge, where they smash into each other, and if two continental plates converge, it'll form mountains. And if continental plates converge with an ocean plate, then the ocean plate subducts. It goes down under the continental plate, starts diving into the mantle, and volcanoes form as that happens. And so mountain building is extremely slow because the plates are moving so slow. It would take eons at today's creeping rates to form those mountains. And so if mountain forming is happening today at such slow rates, then how do creationists explain that evidence? How can that be harmonized with the young earth implied by Scripture? Well, in our last session yesterday, we looked at the idea of Pangea, and we saw several evidences for that. The puzzle-like fit of the continents when they're pushed together, the fact that the rock layers and mountain belts match across continents when these pieces are put together, the fact that fossil distributions match across the pieces. So the problem with the evolutionary view of Pangea is the time frame. They're again assuming uniformitarianism. They're assuming slow and gradual movement of these plates like they're moving today. Well, using the actual evidence from modern geology and plate tectonics, but without that hidden assumption of uniformitarianism, creation geologists have developed our own theory called catastrophic plate tectonics, or CPT. A young Earth creation geophysicist by the name of John Baumgartner laid the groundwork for this back in the 90s when he developed a supercomputer program while he was at UCLA doing his doctoral research in geophysics and space physics, and this is still even being used today. He was at Los Alamos, famous place where he did his work. So the program that he developed is called Terra, and it helps to model the dynamics of the Earth's interior. All right, what's going on under us in the Earth. So based on the predictions of this program, other creation physicists and geologists and even meteorologists jumped in and joined him in developing CPT that describes what we think probably happened when the flood began. And significantly paraphrasing the model, before the flood, the plates didn't exist, the continents weren't separated, and then at the onset of the flood, the fountains of the great deep are broken up, Genesis 7:11, so the plates break apart. And keep in mind that the fountains of the deep there wouldn't necessarily even be solely water. There's debate about that. It could include magma, fountains of magma from the earth. And so according to CPT, something causes the breakup of this ocean floor, the cold, dense ocean floor, breaking it in several places, including breaking the ocean plates away from the continental plates. Now, according to these computer simulations, when that break at these boundaries between the continental plates and the oceanic plates occurs, there would have been a phenomenon called thermal runaway subduction of the sea floor. And so instead of the creeping rate that things are moving into the mantle today, at the beginning of the flood, the sea floor is diving into the mantle basically as fast as you can run. In 1994, when this was being developed, creation scientists predicted, well, if that idea is true, then the entire mantle would have essentially been overturned like a conveyor belt, and there should be evidence of colder material still in the mantle, down at the base of the mantle, because this only happened a few thousand years ago. There hasn't been enough time for all of that pre-flood ocean floor to be totally melted and recycled into the mantle. So if uniformitarian plate tectonics is true, then this process of how slow things are moving today has always gone on. And so there's plenty of time for any of that material from the ocean floor to heat up and get recycled back into the mantle before it gets very deep. In other words, there shouldn't be enormous piles of ocean floor in the mantle. And so this is a place where, again, creationists were able to make a very specific prediction. And what they found is, sure enough, a few years later, after technology got to the point where we could really see what it looks like down there in the mantle, seismic images of the mantle's density structure verified the creationist prediction and showed that there's evidence of enormous piles of cooler material in the mantle, specifically under the subduction zones, piled up on the base of the mantle, apparently remnants of the pre-flood ocean crust piled up down there. And so this rapid diving would have caused the plates to move rapidly on the order of meters per second, rather than the creeping rates today of centimeters per year. And so in other words, the supercontinent, Rodinia, broke apart, began moving rapidly. It actually smashes back together to form Pangea while it's underwater, apparently, and then breaks apart again. And so this would have caused the rapid formation of mountains all along these convergent zones as materials are piling up there and as the plates are buckling, forming like the Appalachians, the Rockies. So you picture this conveyor belt with the cold crust of the ocean floor diving into the mantle and new hot mantle material coming up from the ocean floor, replacing that along these mid-ocean ridges. So this extra hot magma that's coming up to fill these gaps that are getting larger quicker, what's going to happen when that hits the water? Well, it's going to send steam jets into the atmosphere all along these ridges, in the same way if you were to take water and throw it on like a campfire, right? So it's going to jettison steam up into the air along these mid-ocean ridges. And so this would have been coming up all along the divergent zones all over the earth, most of which are in the oceans. And so this would have caused intense rain around the globe as these geysers that stretched for hundreds of miles all over the earth erupt, pumps water high up into the atmosphere, which then comes back down from the heavens onto the land as rain. The added magma to the seafloor, what's that going to do? You got new magma now on the seafloor, replacing the old seafloor. That is going to displace water from the sea onto the land. Now that hot material is replacing, remember, the cold, dense ocean floor, and now it's being replaced with this hotter material. When you heat things, they expand, unless you're talking about water. It's the strange exception. But most things, when you heat them, they expand. And so they're less dense when they're hot, they expand, they're lighter. And so essentially the ocean floor, for a period of time as it's being replaced, is floating higher in the mantle, and it makes the entire sea floor much higher during the flood. Creation physicists believe the ocean floor ultimately at its peak got up to about 3,500 feet higher than it is today. So as the sea floor is raised, water from the seas is being pushed onto the land, carrying with it sediment, sea creatures, explaining why you have even marine creatures across the entire continents, even in the middle of continents, far away from the ocean, even on what are now mountains. And so water is coming in from the ocean as the sea level is rising, in addition to the water coming down from these immense geysers. So tsunamis are going to be going on, rocking the land. I was just at the Creation Geology Society meeting a couple weeks ago, and they were doing simulations on what these tsunamis would have been doing to the land, essentially eroding the pre-flood continents, and then the sediment would start going back out to the ocean, and then the tsunamis would hit it and push it back onto the land. I mean, this is crazy what is going on while this is going on during the flood. So most of the water from the flood is coming from the oceans through these steam jets and the seafloor rising. And keep in mind, while all of that's going on, you also have to keep in mind the meteorite impacts that are occurring. And I found a simulation of what some secular geologists believe about the land configuration and their movements throughout time. And so this would be more like Rodinia here. Creation geologists think that this might have been more centered on the equator, but the configurations and the movements may very well be correct, although much of the land is underwater while this movement is occurring, especially after about 5 months into the flood. And from this simulation, I took all of the known meteorite impacts from the world and where they struck the Earth, and I added them to the simulation, showing approximately when and where those meteorites would have struck during the flood. Now, we keep in mind that these are only the craters that have been discovered thus far. And also, obviously, any meteorites that struck the ocean areas during the flood wouldn't have left craters as readily, which is why the verified meteorite craters are generally land craters. So in order to get a better idea of how many meteorites are striking the Earth during the flood, you have to add quite a few more. And so there are over 100 meteorite craters that have been found on land that correlate to the flood period, but 70% of the surface of the Earth is in the ocean. And so if we take what we know about the land and now extrapolate that to the seas, then you have to add at least 230 more meteorite impacts during the flood. So over 330 meteorites striking the Earth during this event. So clearly meteorites are a significant part of the flood. All right, let's look at Psalm 104. You covered the earth with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took to flight. The mountains rose. The valleys sank down to the place that you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. Well, in light of verse 9, it seems clear that this is talking about the flood, not creation week. Otherwise, this passage would be violated during the flood. But if it is referring to the flood, then it makes perfect sense, because this catastrophic plate tectonics that I'm talking about implies that the high mountains are actually forming during the flood as the plates are smashing into each other at convergence and subduction zones. So due to the formation of the mountains during the flood, it is now impossible for there to be enough water to completely submerge the earth again, just as this passage indicates. The only way you'd be able to is to totally erode the mountains all the way down to their nubs again. And so by the mountains rising and the valley sinking, verse 8, a boundary was set for the water that it might not again cover the earth. Well, according to the text, the rain itself continued for 40 uninterrupted days and nights, but that wasn't the extent of the catastrophe. The waters apparently continued to rise for some time after that, and this would have been probably due to the magma continuing to come up and be dispersed onto the ocean floor and replacing the ocean floor. The rising waters eventually leveled out and apparently began to decrease on the 150th day, so 5 months from the beginning of the flood. Notice that during this catastrophic period, typical earth processes, seasons, days, night, and so forth, are totally disrupted. And after the flood, God promises in chapter 8, verse 22, that he's not going to allow that to happen on a global scale again. And so the disruption of the seasons as well as day and night would be expected with catastrophic plate tectonics. You'd have a lot of cloud cover from not just water, but the aerosols from all the volcanic activity going on. That would have effectively stopped day and night by blocking out sunlight. And with it, summer is basically stopped and much of the heat that we receive. Obviously, seed time and harvest would be stopped while the earth is covered with water. So let's return now to this question. How could the flood be global? How could there be enough water to cover the earth prevailing above the mountains over 20 feet? Well, with this model I've laid out for you, you might already be able to see the answer to that question. And so let's look at the science side first. Remember that catastrophic plate tectonics would say that the water came primarily from the seas, both in the form of rain and in the form of the sea level rising. And you recall from Psalm 104 that your taller mountains are forming during the flood. And you recall from catastrophic plate tectonics that the mountains are forming rapidly as the plates are smashing into each other. And so we realize, therefore, that the pre-flood world would have been much flatter. And so notice it wouldn't have taken nearly, it wouldn't have been nearly as hard to cover the land with water at that point, because the taller mountains wouldn't have even been formed until later in the flood, when the recession had begun. And so notice, if you try to argue that the mountains were formed at creation, you got a problem, but not if we understand that these mountains are actually forming during the flood. So you have to picture a much flatter pre-flood earth, one with a much lower elevation. Covering the highest points on the earth by day 40 even wouldn't require anywhere near the amount of water it would require today. So where did all the water go after the flood? Well, first of all, as the ocean floor was being raised during the flood, and the intense geyser activity is going on from the fountains of the deep, that activity alone would have dumped loads of sediment onto the continents, which would have raised the level of the continents relative to pre-flood times. But plus, mountains would have been forming at these convergence and subduction zones, raising the land in those areas even further. And so notice, without the water even going anywhere, the continents would have been higher in elevation. They're sticking up out of the water further than they would have been in pre-flood times. But then you have to work in other implications of this model. So recall that as the ocean floor is diving into the mantle, new material is coming up and replacing it, and that material is hotter, which means it is less dense, which means it is sitting higher in the mantle, which would have, remember, raised the ocean floor. All right, now what happens as that now starts, so that conveyor belt process stops after the entire ocean floor is replaced, and so now what's going to happen? The steam jets are going to stop. The ocean floor is now going to start cooling. And so it would have become dense again, start sitting lower in the mantle, effectively lowering the sea floor again, allowing the water to go straight back to where it came from, and receding back to the ocean from whence it came. And so bottom line, there is no problem from science in explaining where the water came from and where it went afterward. Other evidences of a global flood from science: the Cambrian Explosion, remember, which we already talked about, is a worldwide explosion of fossils that begins at the base of the fossil record. This is not a local fossil deposit. This is global. The sudden explosion of life across the entire planet suggests a worldwide catastrophic event. Another evidence: long-distance travel of sediment. When we look at material found in the rock layers below us in various places, like in the Grand Canyon, for example. In many cases, what geologists believe to be the source of that material, like where it came from, is located hundreds to thousands of miles away from where it was deposited in the Grand Canyon. I mean, sure, wind and water can erode rock and carry the material relatively short distances, a few miles, for example, but hundreds to thousands of miles? And the final sediment deposits can be hundreds of feet thick, taller than this church building, okay? And so these observed facts suggest a major catastrophe that affected the entire planet. Another evidence: mega seismites. And I want to camp out here for a little bit, and because this is some of the field research that I've been involved in myself with some Croatian geologists. For a couple of years, 2014 and 2016, I had the opportunity to participate in some geologic field expeditions for several days, traveling up to eastern Wyoming with Dr. Kurt Wise to study the Lance Formation. And I tell you what, based on the time, I want to be able to let you guys go eat at 7:45. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to keep rolling on this tomorrow, and instead I got 4 minutes. And I want to use this time to answer any questions you might have. How about that? Anybody have any questions so far about what we're covering? It's a lot of material, most of which you might not have heard unless you were here last fall whenever I got to go through some of this then. Yeah. Okay, good question. So I talked about, okay, so what he said is, if you got 215 million up to maybe 1 billion humans on the planet, where's the human fossils in the flood layers? That is a big mystery, because when you're going, remember I told you, as you're going through the fossil record, you see what appears to be the progress of the flood. It's wiping out habitats from the seafloor to the fish to the coastal lands to further inland. There is an entire habitat missing, okay? And it's the habitat that has humans, larger mammals, and your angiosperm trees and plants, the flowering plants. That's totally gone. So notice even today you tend to have separate habitats, but in the pre-flood world, the fossil records suggest things were even more sequestered. And there's an entire habitat that is just gone. It was obliterated in the flood. And there's, I think the theological explanation is that these people were wicked. You know, we think it's bad today, but I mean, there's still a lot of good people in our country. This was a time when all of those people were only wicked constantly. They only intended to do wicked things. And God is wanting to restart, and he's not wanting to get back to that point. So if you're God, you don't want archaeologists and paleontologists to be able to dig down and study humans and figure out what they're doing, or you're basically going to be back to where you started. So you need to wipe it out. You got to start over. And there's different ways you can do that. I mean, you could totally erode that wherever they're at, where you just totally obliterate that entire ecosystem through erosion. But even then, you're going to tend to have fossils, unless it is a higher elevation, where they're going to tend to float. You're not going to fossilize if you're floating on the surface of the flood. You've got to be buried by mudslides and so forth. What is more likely, I think what could be going on is that entire habitat was at a subduction zone. And basically, like Corridathan and Abiram, they go down into the earth. Like so, in geologic terms, we're talking a subduction zone. So that entire ecosystem just goes down into the earth, maybe right towards the very beginning of the flood. And so they're gone. And so, you know, we find strange anomalies where it seems like there's human footprints over here in this habitat, but those are, they're the exception. The entire habitat of these guys is gone. And so if it's true that there were humans that were running, maybe were running away from the flood or something, every now and then you might find something that's, oh, that's strange that that's there, but the general rule is that it's gone. It's totally missing. And so, a lot of debate about that, but it makes sense, I think, scientifically and theologically why it's not there. How much time we got? Maybe 1 minute? Another question?
Is there a consensus on what happened to the Ark post-flood?
The Ark? Okay. A consensus depends on how you define consensus. There are, you know, a few people that are still trying to search for it. But the general thinking among the creation scientists is that you got some major problems with it. First of all, you know, think about, for example, the Titanic. There was, just a few years ago, they put out this in the news saying, hey, if there's anything you want to go check out on the Titanic, you better go right now, because that steel is already totally eroded and it's about to collapse. And so everybody went over there to try to get everything out of the Titanic. And so that is what happens with things decaying. And so even if you freeze it or whatever, you've got a problem with trying to get a vessel like that to survive that much time. But on top of that, you've got the issue of if you're Noah and you're coming off of the ark, what is going to be the easiest way for you to get shelter and build things? Well, I tell you, I'm probably going to want to use that ark, and I don't even want the ark to stick around, because what's probably going to happen if it does? It's going to become some shrine or something. And a third major problem is where we think the ark was, the mountains of Ararat, if we understand that that is what they were at that time, the top layers are Cenozoic material, which is stuff deposited after the flood. You follow the implications? So it would mean that the ark would have had to have been totally covered with not ice, but sediment. Like it would have had to have been, it was hit by sediment in the Cenozoic period, so after the flood, and which would have obliterated the remains of the ark. So the bulk of the creation scientists are not taking time to go look for it. But there are still a few guys that are still hopeful that they'll find it. It's just that it's always been ironic, it's been frustrating to me how nobody has ever been able to come out with conclusive evidence. It's always like, man, we see this thing, you see if you look at it with your leg up, then you can see, and it's kind of like, well, come on, I mean, this should be, we should be able to see this by now. And I'm just not seeing it. So look, the creation science already gets enough scoffers as it is. And so I try to be very careful not to jump down rabbit holes. We're already scientifically got some potential problems. We got enough powerful evidence to prove, a lot of stuff without going down that route. And so Hey, but you know, the conventional or the consensus view may be wrong. I'm not at all saying it's not possible. I do think it's interesting that Josephus seems to mention maybe the ark existing by his time, and I haven't looked in exactly what he says about that time, but that would be a long time after the ark came to rest in the mountains of Ararat, if that's true. But anyway, okay, if you have any other questions, you can come ask me. Otherwise, let's go ahead and break where everybody can actually get some cookies tonight. So I think you go out this door and take a left, and they're right back here, I think is where they are. Thank you for your attention. We'll finish the flood tomorrow and then move on to the Ice Age after that.